The mail still sat on the porch 3 days later on Evergreen Lane in Willow Creek, a small tree-lined suburb just outside of Portland, Oregon. It was an anomaly in a neighborhood where routines were as predictable as the changing seasons. The morning newspaper, usually retrieved before dawn, lay beneath a thin film of dew, and a stack of flyers for local businesses began to curl at the edges. This unusual stillness around the home of Sarah and Robert Jenkins was the first subtle tremor in the quiet, orderly facade of their lives, and indeed, of the entire community. Sarah Jenkins, aged 47, was not a woman prone to spontaneous departures. Her life was meticulously structured around her work as a high school English teacher, her family, and her volunteer efforts at the local animal shelter. She was known for her punctuality, her gentle demeanor, and the care with which she tended her rose garden, visible from the street. Her husband, Robert, a 50-year-old accountant with a penchant for classic cars, had initially dismissed her absence as a brief, unannounced trip, perhaps to visit a friend. But as hours bled into days, his concern ripened into a cold dread. Her car remained in the driveway, her purse on the kitchen counter, and her phone, an old flip model, was found under a sofa cushion in the living room. Dead. This was not like Sarah. The undisturbed breakfast table, still set for two, with cereal boxes and milk left out, hinted at an abrupt interruption. Robert Jenkins, a man accustomed to order and clear figures, found himself adrift in a sea of unknowns. He had called her friends, her colleagues, and even the animal shelter, each conversation ending in a polite, sympathetic dead end. He had tried to rationalize, to invent scenarios, a sudden illness, a spontaneous getaway that had somehow gone uncommunicated. But the accumulating evidence of her normal routine being suddenly abandoned chipped away at these comforting fictions. On the third day, as the mail piled higher and the silence in the house grew heavier, Robert made the call that would irrevocably alter their lives and expose the hidden currents beneath the calm surface of Willow Creek. He dialed the Portland Police Bureau, his voice a tight, strained whisper as he reported his wife, Sarah Jenkins, missing. The initial response from the Portland Police Bureau was standard for a missing persons report. Officers arrived at the Jenkins residence on Evergreen Lane, their blue lights casting a subdued glow on the meticulously maintained home. They interviewed Robert, meticulously documenting his account of Sarah's last known movements. She had gone to bed as usual on Tuesday night, November 12th, at around 10:30 p.m. He had woken up on Wednesday morning, November 13th, at 6:00 a.m., and she was gone. No note, no explanation, no sign of forced entry. The officers performed a cursory sweep of the house, noting the undisturbed state of affairs. The wedding photo on the mantelpiece, capturing Sarah and Robert on their wedding day 25 years prior, seemed to stare out with a quiet, unsettling judgment. They spoke of the quiet suburbs, how strange this was. Detective Lena Hansen, a seasoned officer with a reputation for her methodical approach, was assigned to the case the following morning, November 16th. She reviewed the initial report, her eyes scanning for anomalies. The lack of any obvious signs of a struggle, the presence of her car and personal effects, all pointed away from an abduction by a stranger. This suggested something more intimate, more personal. She dispatched patrol units to canvass the immediate neighborhood, knocking on doors along Evergreen Lane and the adjacent streets, Cedarwood Drive and Maple Street. Residents, initially surprised by the police presence, offered little new information beyond vague recollections of Sarah walking her small terrier, Buster, or tending her roses. They spoke of the Jenkinses as a quiet, respectable couple, pillars of the community. Emily Jenkins, Sarah, and Robert's 20-year-old daughter, was away at Portland State University, just a short drive from Willow Creek. She had been distraught when her father called her, initially dismissing it as a misunderstanding. Emily had a close bond with her mother, often calling her daily. The lack of any contact from Sarah was profoundly unsettling for her. She immediately drove home, her Ford Focus pulling into the driveway of the silent house, the sight of the still piled mail confirming her worst fear. Her boyfriend, Mark Miller, a 21-year-old aspiring musician she had been dating for 2 years, accompanied her. Mark offered quiet support, his arm around Emily as she tried to make sense of her mother's inexplicable absence. He spoke softly, reassuring Emily that her mother would be found, expressing his own concern for Sarah, whom he knew well from frequent visits to the Jenkins household. The search expanded beyond the immediate neighborhood. Missing persons flyers, featuring Sarah's smiling face, were distributed throughout Willow Creek and into downtown Portland. Local news channels picked up the story, the quiet dignity of Robert Jenkins making a tearful appeal for his wife's return. The community rallied, volunteers organizing search parties for nearby parks and wooded areas, their efforts meticulous but fruitless. The dense, rain-soaked undergrowth of Forest Park, miles of untouched wilderness, seemed to swallow their hopes whole. The initial confusion had now solidified into a pervasive, gnawing anxiety. The ordinary hum of Willow Creek had been replaced by a discordant silence. There was a sense that an unseen predator had moved through their placid streets, leaving only absence in its wake. The undisturbed breakfast table remained, a poignant still life, testament to a morning that had begun like any other, only to be violently, inexplicably unfinished. Days turned into a week. Detective Hansen continued her methodical approach, interviewing Robert and Emily again, this time with greater scrutiny. She asked about Sarah's relationships, her habits, any recent changes or stresses. Robert maintained that their marriage was stable, idyllic even. He spoke of Sarah as his rock, the steady center of their family. Emily, tearful and fragile, confirmed this depiction, speaking of her mother as a kind, unwavering presence in her life. Both father and daughter could offer no plausible explanation for Sarah's disappearance. No enemies, no financial troubles, no known psychological issues. The portrait they painted was one of unblemished domesticity. However, the police began to uncover small, almost imperceptible inconsistencies, cracks in the seemingly perfect facade. A neighbor on Cedarwood Drive, Mrs. Henderson, recalled seeing Sarah's car leave the driveway late on the Tuesday night she was last seen. An unusual occurrence. Mrs. Henderson was an insomniac, often awake during the quiet hours. She noted the time as just past 11:00 p.m., an hour after Robert said Sarah had gone to bed. She was not certain, she admitted, but the sight of the familiar sedan pulling out under the faint glow of the streetlights had stuck with her. This contradicted Robert's timeline, creating a subtle disjunction in the established narrative. The car, a beige Honda Accord, had been found parked in the driveway when police arrived, its ignition cold, its interior seemingly undisturbed. Detectives focused on Sarah's digital footprint. Her computer, found closed on her desk, showed no unusual activity, no recent searches for travel destinations, no frantic emails. Her phone, the old flip model, held only routine call logs to family and friends. No suspicious contacts, no frantic messages. It was as if Sarah Jenkins had simply vanished into thin air, leaving no trace in the digital realm that so often chronicles modern lives. Yet, the small detail from Mrs. Henderson, though seemingly insignificant, began to nag at Detective Hansen. Why would Sarah's car be out late, if she was already in bed? And if she was out, why was the car back in the driveway, and Sarah still missing? Investigators also spoke with Sarah's colleagues at Franklin High School. They described her as dedicated and respected, a quiet force in the English department. No one reported any recent arguments or unusual behavior. One colleague, however, mentioned that Sarah had seemed preoccupied in the weeks leading up to her disappearance, often staring blankly during faculty meetings, her usual cheerful demeanor subtly muted. It was nothing specific, just a vague sense of distraction. This was not a lead, but it added to the growing mosaic of subtle disharmony beneath the surface. The collective memory of Sarah Jenkins was one of a woman who was kind, reliable, and deeply private. The police expanded their search for any hidden details, any clue that might offer direction. They obtained cell tower data for Sarah's inactive phone, attempting to reconstruct her movements in the days prior to her disappearance, but the data was inconclusive for the limited period they could access, especially for an older model that didn't constantly ping cell towers like newer smartphones. They also began to look at Robert and Emily more closely, a standard procedure in missing persons cases where foul play is suspected and no external threats are apparent. Both were cooperative, their grief palpable. Robert had no known enemies, no significant debts. Emily was a college student, seemingly focused on her studies and her relationship with Mark Miller. Mark Miller, Emily's boyfriend, continued to be a constant presence at the Jenkins home, offering comfort to Emily and Robert. He helped with the search efforts, putting up flyers, and speaking calmly to the media about the importance of finding Sarah. He presented himself as a concerned young man, deeply integrated into the family's grief. Yet, his composure, perhaps, was a little too perfect. Detective Hansen, with her quiet observation skills, noted the way he seemed to hover, always a step away, always listening intently to every new piece of information shared by the police. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible detail, but it lodged in her mind. He was a steady, seemingly unshakable presence amidst chaos, which struck her as mildly unnatural. The air in the Jenkins household, once filled with the muted sounds of everyday life, was now choked by a palpable tension, a silent question hanging over everyone. A week and a half after Sarah Jenkins was reported missing, the weather in Portland, Oregon shifted, bringing with it a heavy, relentless rain that mirrored the somber mood of Willow Creek. On November 22nd, a volunteer search party, organized by a local church group and led by Reverend Thomas, trudged through the waterlogged trails of Lewis and Clark State Recreation Area, a sprawling, wooded park situated just a few miles east of the Jenkins home. The area was popular for hiking, but known for its dense foliage and steep ravines, making it a challenging environment for any search operation. It was a cold, desolate afternoon when a member of the group, a retired schoolteacher named Eleanor Vance, veered slightly off the main trail, drawn by a faint glint amidst the sodden leaves. Beneath a tangle of blackberry bushes, partially concealed by fallen branches, she discovered a small, distinctively embroidered scarf. Its delicate pattern of purple irises was immediately recognizable. It was Sarah Jenkins' scarf. Eleanor Vance, her heart pounding, immediately called out to the other searchers. The discovery sent a jolt through the entire search party. This was not the confirmation anyone wanted, but it was a concrete lead, a chilling sign that Sarah had indeed been in this isolated area. The scarf was damp, but otherwise intact, with no obvious signs of struggle around it, yet its very presence spoke volumes. The Portland Police Bureau was immediately notified. Detective Hansen arrived within minutes, the flashing lights of patrol cars cutting through the rain-soaked landscape. The area was quickly cordoned off with bright yellow crime tape, a stark contrast to the muted greens and browns of the forest floor. A forensic team, equipped with specialized gear for outdoor crime scenes, began a meticulous grid search around the discovery site. The ground was soft, saturated with rain, making it difficult to discern subtle impressions, but the conditions also preserved some elements. Within 2 hours, the search yielded a second, far more grim discovery. Approximately 50 yards deeper into the dense underbrush, down a slight embankment, the lifeless body of Sarah Jenkins was found. Her body lay partially hidden, covered by a hastily piled assortment of leaves and branches. It was clear this was not an accidental death. The position of her body, the specific injuries visible even through the initial examination, confirmed the worst fears. Sarah Jenkins had been murdered. The medical examiner was called to the scene, beginning their preliminary assessment in the field before the body was carefully transported to the Oregon State Medical Examiner's office in Portland. Robert and Emily Jenkins were immediately notified, the news delivered by Detective Hansen herself, her voice heavy with the terrible truth. The quiet devastation that followed was palpable, a collective gasp that seemed to echo through the once tranquil streets of Willow Creek. The missing person case had now transformed into a full-scale homicide investigation. The crime scene at Lewis and Clark State Recreation Area was painstakingly processed for the next 2 days. Despite the continued rain, every leaf, every branch, every speck of disturbed earth was documented, photographed, and cataloged. The goal was to reconstruct the events that had led to Sarah's death, to find any foreign objects, any fibers, any trace evidence that could link a perpetrator to the victim and the location. Tire tracks were noted on a dirt access road nearby, faint but discernible. Footprints, too, were sought, but the saturated ground made clear impressions difficult to obtain. The scene felt desolate, a profound emptiness left behind by a violent act. The preliminary findings from the medical examiner's office were grim. Sarah Jenkins had died from blunt force trauma to the head, consistent with multiple blows. There were also signs of defensive wounds on her arms and hands, indicating a struggle. The estimated time of death was consistent with the night she was last seen, Tuesday, November 12th, or the very early hours of Wednesday, November 13th. This timeline aligned with Miss Henderson's sighting of Sarah's car leaving the driveway late that Tuesday night. The presence of mud and plant debris on Sarah's clothing, consistent with the vegetation found at the park, suggested her body had been left there soon after her death. The cause of death immediately sharpened the focus of the investigation. This was not a random act of violence, but a brutal personal assault. With Sarah's death confirmed as a homicide, the police shifted their focus from finding a missing person to finding a killer. Their first priority was a thorough examination of Sarah's personal life, her relationships, and any potential conflicts. Robert and Emily, while grieving, remain persons of interest, standard practice for immediate family. Their alibis were re-examined with more stringent detail. Robert's account of being asleep at home seemed to hold, though the lack of any direct witness to him being in bed and asleep left a small crack. Emily had been at her college dorm, verified by friends and campus security logs. The forensic analysis continued. Underneath Sarah's fingernails, minuscule traces of skin and fiber were found, crucial evidence that pointed to a struggle. The fibers were sent to the lab for analysis, a painstaking process that could take days or even weeks. Additionally, a distinctive pattern of shoe print was discovered near the body, partially obscured but distinct enough for a casting to be made. This print was not consistent with any shoes found at the Jenkins residence or with any known footprints of the search party members. It was a fresh lead, a tangible link to the perpetrator, waiting for a match. Detectives revisited Mark Miller, Emily's boyfriend. He had been so helpful during the search, so composed. But Hansen's instincts, honed over years of investigations, told her something was off. His initial interview had been brief, sympathetic. Now, the questions became sharper, more direct. He stated he had been at his apartment in Northwest Portland on the night of November 12th. Alone. He had studied, played guitar, and gone to bed early. He offered no one to corroborate his alibi. This lack of an alibi, while not proof of guilt, immediately raised a flag for Detective Hansen. She requested his shoes for examination, explaining it was standard procedure for anyone close to the victim. Mark, surprisingly, complied without hesitation, handing over a pair of hiking boots he claimed to wear frequently. The initial forensic analysis of the fibers found under Sarah's fingernails yielded a significant finding. They were synthetic, uncommon, and consistent with material often used in outdoor gear or certain types of work gloves. This was the first concrete forensic clue pointing to an outside presence. More critically, initial laboratory comparisons of the shoe print found at the crime scene with Mark Miller's hiking boots revealed a high degree of similarity in tread pattern and size. While not an exact match given the muddied conditions, the pattern was strikingly consistent. This was the first major forensic reveal, a chilling piece of evidence that began to accelerate the focus of the investigation, drawing the net tighter around Emily's boyfriend. The quiet grief in the Jenkins household now began to transform into a silent, unsettling suspicion. The discovery of the striking similarity between the shoe print at the crime scene and Mark Miller's hiking boots transformed him from a grieving family friend into a prime suspect. Detective Hansen, with this crucial piece of forensic evidence, brought Mark in for a more intensive interview at the Portland Police Bureau's Homicide Division. He arrived willingly, still projecting an air of calm concern, but a subtle tension was now visible in his posture, a slight tremor in his hand. The interview room was sterile, devoid of distraction, the camera recording his every flicker of expression. Hansen began by calmly presenting the forensic evidence, not as an accusation, but as an objective fact. She described the shoe print, the unique tread pattern, and then displayed a photograph of Mark's own boots. Mark's composed facade began to crack. He stammered, insisting it must be a coincidence, that many boots had similar treads. He claimed he hadn't been to Lewis and Clark State Recreation Area in months. His denials, however, lacked conviction, tinged with a desperate edge. As the interview progressed, Hansen shifted tactics, subtly pressing on the timeline of Sarah's last known hours, returning to Mrs. Henderson's sighting of Sarah's car. She asked Mark if he knew of any reason Sarah might have been out late that Tuesday night. Mark's initial answers remained evasive, but the pressure mounted. He squirmed, wiped sweat from his brow, his eyes darting around the room. Then, Detective Hansen introduced a new, shocking element. She revealed that phone records, newly obtained, showed a series of text messages and calls between Sarah Jenkins and Mark Miller, late at night in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. These were not the casual messages between a mother and her daughter's boyfriend. Their content was intimate, suggestive, and deeply personal. This was the key narrative twist, the devastating truth hidden beneath the surface of the Jenkins family's seemingly perfect life. The messages painted a clear picture of a clandestine affair, an emotional and physical entanglement that had been ongoing for months. One message from Sarah to Mark read, I can't stop thinking about you. This is dangerous, but I don't care. Another from Mark to Sarah. When can I see you? Emily's out tonight. The revelations were shattering not just for the Jenkins family, but for the entire carefully constructed narrative of Sarah Jenkins' life. The polite, respectable high school teacher had been living a secret life, a betrayal that now cast a dark shadow over her memory. Mark Miller, confronted with the irrefutable digital evidence, finally broke. His carefully constructed composure shattered, replaced by a mixture of shame and anger. He confessed to the affair, his voice hoarse, recounting how it had begun innocently enough during casual conversations at the Jenkins home, slowly escalating from shared glances to secret meetings. He described the thrill, the danger, and the growing intensity of their hidden relationship. Emily, their daughter, had no idea. Robert, her husband, remained oblivious. The betrayal was profound, layered, and utterly devastating. The revelation of the affair provided a powerful, immediate motive for Sarah's murder. Mark admitted that on the night of November 12th, Sarah had driven to his apartment in northwest Portland, a clandestine meeting they had planned. They had argued fiercely. Sarah wanted to end the affair, fearing discovery and the destruction of her family. Mark, however, had grown increasingly possessive, unwilling to let her go. He spoke of his love for her, a twisted, desperate affection. The argument had escalated, fueled by desperation and a sense of impending loss. This confession, though partial, was crucial. It cemented the link between the shoe prints, the timeline, and a clear, explosive motive. The noose was now tightening around Mark Miller. The police, armed with Mark's confession and the mounting forensic evidence, now moved swiftly. A search warrant was executed for Mark Miller's apartment on NW 23rd Avenue in Portland. Detectives meticulously combed through the small, cluttered space. They found a pair of work gloves in a utility drawer, their material consistent with the synthetic fibers found under Sarah's fingernails. A deeper search revealed a hidden compartment in his closet, containing a small blood-stained rock. Forensic analysis would later confirm the blood matched Sarah Jenkins' DNA profile. This was the definitive piece of evidence, the final, undeniable link to the murder. Mark Miller was formally arrested and charged with the murder of Sarah Jenkins. The news sent shockwaves through Willow Creek and beyond. The story of the respectable teacher, the loving mother, and her secret affair with her daughter's boyfriend, culminating in her brutal death, dominated local and national headlines. The community struggled to reconcile the public persona of Sarah Jenkins with the private truth that had emerged. Neighbors whispered, friends grappled with disbelief, and the serene quiet of Willow Creek was permanently fractured by the weight of this grim reality. The Jenkins family, already shattered by Sarah's death, now faced a new, excruciating layer of grief and betrayal. With Mark Miller's arrest, the legal process commenced. He was formally indicted by a grand jury, charged with one count of murder in the first degree. During his arraignment in Multnomah County Circuit Court in downtown Portland, Mark Miller entered a plea of not guilty, despite his earlier partial confession. This was a standard move by his court-appointed defense attorney, who immediately began to formulate a strategy. The defense would attempt to suppress the confession, arguing it was coerced, and would challenge the forensic evidence, seeking to cast doubt on its conclusiveness. The prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney Helen Davies, prepared for a long and arduous trial, meticulously compiling the vast array of evidence they had gathered. The impact on Robert and Emily Jenkins was profound and devastating. Robert, a man who had always prided himself on his stable, orderly life, found his world utterly demolished. The grief for his murdered wife was compounded by the searing pain of her betrayal, a betrayal with his own daughter's boyfriend. He isolated himself, the once inviting Jenkins home on Evergreen Lane becoming a somber mausoleum. Emily, meanwhile, was adrift in a sea of conflicting emotions. Her mother, her closest confidant, was gone, murdered by the man she loved. The man who had been her boyfriend, her comfort, her future, was now revealed as a calculating betrayer and a killer. The trust she had placed in both of them had been brutally shattered. Emily suffered from severe emotional distress, withdrawing from her university studies and retreating into herself. She was haunted by the image of her mother and the man she had loved. Together, secretly, friends and family struggled to comprehend the enormity of the situation. They offered condolences, but beneath the sympathy lay an uncomfortable silence, a shared knowledge of the scandal that had ripped through the Jenkins family. Neighbors on Evergreen Lane who had once seen Sarah Jenkins as the epitome of suburban grace, now grappled with the cognitive dissonance of her secret life. The illusion of safety and normalcy in Willow Creek had been irrevocably broken. The public perception of Sarah Jenkins became a complex tapestry of sympathy for the victim and judgment for her choices. While Mark Miller was universally condemned as a manipulative and dangerous individual, as the pretrial motions unfolded, the defense's strategy began to emerge. They aimed to portray the affair as consensual, an emotional entanglement that had spun out of control, hinting at Sarah's role in initiating and perpetuating the liaison. They also attempted to argue that Mark, in a moment of emotional distress, had acted without premeditation, seeking a lesser charge of manslaughter. This narrative, while not excusing Mark's actions, sought to diminish his culpability and portray him as a victim of passion. The prosecution, however, remained steadfast, focusing on the brutality of the murder, the careful concealment of the body, and the premeditated nature of Mark's actions in confronting Sarah about ending the affair. They stressed the calculated nature of the crime, highlighting the evidence of a clear plan and the coldness with which the body was hidden. The Portland community watched, captivated and horrified as the details of the case continued to unfold in the media. The legal battle would not only determine Mark Miller's fate, but would also publicly dissect the private, tragic lives of Sarah and Robert Jenkins, and their daughter Emily. The weight of the upcoming trial, the search for true justice in the face of such profound betrayal and loss, loomed heavily over everyone connected to the case. The quiet suburban street of Evergreen Lane, once a symbol of peaceful domesticity, now stood as a silent testament to hidden desires and the devastating consequences of their revelation. The air was thick with the unspoken, the profound questions that hung over the shattered remnants of a family. On a cold gray morning, in April, nearly 5 months after Sarah Jenkins' body was discovered, the trial of Mark Miller commenced at the Multnomah County Circuit Court in downtown Portland. The courtroom, Department 15, was packed, a tangible buzz of anticipation filling the air. Media representatives, legal observers, and members of the public vied for seats. Robert Jenkins sat in the front row, his face etched with a profound weariness. Emily beside him, her gaze fixed, unwavering. They were there to bear witness, to seek a semblance of justice. Jury selection had been a grueling process, with attorneys scrutinizing potential jurors for any bias related to the lurid nature of the affair. Finally, a panel of 12 was seated, their faces a mixture of solemnity and curiosity. Judge Eleanor Vance, a no-nonsense jurist, presided over the proceedings, her presence commanding respect and order. Assistant District Attorney Helen Davies delivered a concise yet devastating opening statement. She painted a picture of Sarah Jenkins, a dedicated teacher and mother, whose life was brutally cut short. She then systematically laid out the prosecution's case, detailing the secret affair with Mark Miller, the desperate argument, the blunt force trauma, and the painstaking efforts to conceal the crime. She presented the evidence, the shoe print, the fibers, the bloodied rock found in Miller's apartment, and the damning text messages. Davies stated that Mark Miller, driven by possessiveness and rage, had taken Sarah's life to prevent the affair from coming to light, to maintain his twisted control over her. Her voice was steady, methodical, laying out the facts like pieces of an unassailable puzzle. Mark Miller's defense attorney, Arthur Hayes, a public defender known for his tenacity, countered with an opening statement that acknowledged the affair but sought to reframe the narrative. He conceded that his client and Sarah Jenkins had been involved in a complex and ultimately tragic relationship. However, he argued that the death was not premeditated murder, but a moment of extreme emotional disturbance, a tragic accident born from a heated argument. He hinted at Sarah's culpability in initiating the affair and the intense emotional turmoil it created, suggesting Mark was overwhelmed by circumstances. He spoke of an impulsive act, not a calculated killing. The prosecution then called its first witnesses. Robert Jenkins took the stand, his voice breaking as he described the last time he saw his wife, the quiet normalcy of their life, before her disappearance. He spoke of his love for Sarah, his utter devastation upon learning of her death, and the profound shock of the affair. His testimony was brief, poignant, and delivered with a raw grief that resonated throughout the courtroom. Emily Jenkins followed, her testimony even more harrowing. She recounted her close relationship with her mother, her initial concern, and the unimaginable pain of discovering the dual betrayal. Her voice was barely a whisper, as she identified Mark Miller, her former boyfriend, as the man who had murdered her mother. She described the emotional agony of confronting the man she loved, now revealed as her mother's killer and betrayer, her tears silent as she recounted the day she learned of the affair, a betrayal that felt like a secondary murder. Detective Lena Hansen testified, detailing the meticulous police investigation, from the initial missing persons report to the discovery of Sarah's body and the subsequent forensic analysis. She walked the jury through the crime scene photos, the evidence collection, and the timeline of events. She explained how the shoe print led them to Mark Miller, how the phone records unveiled the affair, and how the search of his apartment yielded the crucial bloodied rock and work gloves. Her testimony was clinical, factual, building a relentless chain of evidence linking Miller directly to the crime. She spoke with a quiet authority, presenting the facts without embellishment, allowing the evidence to speak for itself. Forensic pathologist Dr. Anya Sharma presented the gruesome details of Sarah Jenkins' autopsy. She described the blunt force trauma to the head as the cause of death, consistent with multiple blows. She detailed the defensive wounds, indicating Sarah had fought for her life. Dr. Sharma also confirmed the presence of synthetic fibers under Sarah's fingernails, and the DNA match from the blood on the rock to Sarah Jenkins. Her testimony was dispassionate, yet the graphic details resonated deeply with the jury. The prosecution systematically presented the text messages between Sarah and Mark, projected onto large screens in the courtroom, their intimate, desperate words hanging heavy in the air, a stark, public revelation of their hidden liaison. Each piece of evidence, each testimony served to tighten the net around Mark Miller, leaving little room for doubt regarding his involvement. The defense's cross-examination of these witnesses sought to chip away at the prosecution's narrative, but with limited success. Hayes attempted to question Robert Jenkins' knowledge of his wife's movements, implying his own ignorance. He pressed Emily Jenkins on the nature of her relationship with Mark, suggesting it was volatile. However, both remained composed, their sorrow and conviction unwavering. The courtroom air was thick with the weight of raw truth and profound loss. The presentation of the bloodied rock and the intimate texts served as the pivotal turning points, casting an unyielding pall over the defense's attempts to diffuse the gravity of the situation. The image of the rock, a brutal instrument of death, stood in stark contrast to the whispered words of secret affection, painting a grim portrait of passion turned deadly. The defense phase of the trial began, Arthur Hayes attempting to counter the prosecution's overwhelming evidence. His primary strategy was not to deny Mark Miller's involvement in Sarah Jenkins' death, which was now undeniable, but to argue for a reduced charge. He aimed to convince the jury that the killing was not premeditated murder, but an impulsive act, a tragic culmination of a heated, emotionally charged argument. He sought to portray Mark as a young man overwhelmed by a complex illicit affair with an older, married woman, a situation that had spiraled out of his control. Hayes called a forensic psychologist, Evelyn Reed, to testify. Dr. Reed presented a psychological profile of Mark Miller, suggesting he suffered from an immature attachment style and an inability to cope with rejection. She testified that the affair, while consensual, had become an overwhelming emotional anchor for Mark, leading to a state of heightened emotional distress when Sarah sought to end it. She argued that on the night of the murder, Mark was in a state of emotional overload, and his actions, while tragic, were not the result of malice aforethought, but of a profound momentary loss of control. She characterized the event as a crime of passion, hoping to sway the jury towards a lesser charge of manslaughter. Her testimony, while theoretical, attempted to inject a layer of mitigating circumstances into the brutal facts. During cross-examination, Assistant District Attorney Helen Davies relentlessly challenged Dr. Reed's conclusions. Davies pressed Dr. Reed on the objectivity of her assessment, pointing out that her insights were based solely on interviews with Mark Miller, a self-serving source. Davies highlighted the inconsistencies in Miller's statements, his initial denials, and the deliberate act of concealing the body, which contradicted the idea of a spontaneous, panicked reaction. She forcefully argued that premeditation was evident in Miller's efforts to dispose of the body and cover his tracks, showcasing a calculated, rational decision-making process even after the fatal blows. The image of the hastily buried body in the dense undergrowth, carefully covered, stood as a stark counterpoint to the defense's narrative of a momentary lapse. The defense also briefly called a neighbor of Mark Miller, a young man who vaguely recalled seeing Mark at his apartment around the time of the murder. But his testimony was weak and easily discredited by the prosecution, which pointed to the cell tower data showing Mark's phone pinging closer to Lewis and Clark State Recreation Area around the time of Sarah's death. The defense sought to suggest that the police had focused too narrowly on Mark, but they presented no credible alternative suspects or explanations for the forensic evidence. The prosecution then called rebuttal witnesses, including a police expert on crime scene reconstruction, who meticulously detailed how the scene indicated not a panicked, spontaneous act, but a deliberate effort to dispose of evidence and conceal the crime. He explained the precise nature of the body's concealment, the selective covering with branches and leaves, and the efforts to remove any obvious trace. In his closing argument, Arthur Hayes appealed to the jury's sense of empathy, describing Mark Miller as a flawed young man who made a terrible mistake under immense emotional pressure. He emphasized the gray areas of human relationships and the tragic unforeseen consequences. He conceded that Mark was responsible for Sarah's death, but he urged the jury to consider the context, to see it as a manslaughter, not murder, a moment of explosive, uncontrolled rage rather than a cold, calculated plan. He reiterated that the affair was complex, and Sarah was not entirely without agency in its development. Helen Davies, in her powerful rebuttal and closing statement, focused on the stark, undeniable facts. She meticulously reviewed the evidence, the brutal nature of the injuries, the presence of Mark Miller's distinctive shoe print at the remote crime scene, the synthetic fibers, the bloodied rock found in his apartment, and the intimate, possessive text messages. She dismissed the crime of passion defense as a cynical attempt to deflect from the deliberate act of murder. She reminded the jury of the deceit, the betrayal, and the calculated attempts to cover up the crime. Davies portrayed Mark Miller not as a victim of circumstances, but as a perpetrator driven by a desperate need for control and a ruthless disregard for human life. She ended with a powerful appeal for justice for Sarah Jenkins, for Robert, and for Emily, whose lives had been irrevocably shattered. The jury was instructed by Judge Vance on the nuances of murder versus manslaughter, the definitions of premeditation, and the burden of proof. With the heavy weight of the evidence and the emotionally charged arguments fresh in their minds, the jury retired for deliberation. The courtroom was silent, save for the rustle of papers and the low hum of the ventilation system. Robert and Emily Jenkins sat motionless, their faces reflecting the years of pain and the uncertain hope for a verdict that would bring a measure of peace. The entire community of Willow Creek held its breath, awaiting the decision that would either condemn or offer a different interpretation of the devastating truth that had emerged from the suburban shadows. The clock in the courtroom seemed to tick with an unbearable slowness, each second stretching into an eternity of anticipation. The jury deliberated for 2 full days. Each hour was an agonizing stretch for Robert and Emily Jenkins, who waited in a small, sterile room just outside the courtroom, their nerves frayed. The silence was surgical, punctuated only by occasional murmurs and the distant sounds of the Portland streets. On the 3rd day, a note was passed to Judge Vance. A verdict had been reached. The courtroom was summoned, once again filling to capacity, a tense anticipation gripping every person present. Mark Miller was led back into the courtroom, his face pale, his eyes scanning the gallery, perhaps searching for an unlikely shred of sympathy. Judge Vance read the verdict. The jury found Mark Miller guilty of murder in the 1st degree in the death of Sarah Jenkins. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom, quickly followed by the distinct sound of Robert Jenkins exhaling a long, shuddering breath of relief. Emily Jenkins, her face streaked with tears, gripped her father's hand tightly, a silent acknowledgement of the justice that had been rendered. Mark Miller remained stoic, his expression unreadable, though a slight tremor in his jaw was visible. The sentence for murder in the 1st degree in Oregon carried a mandatory minimum of 25 years to life in prison. The sentencing hearing was scheduled several weeks later. This phase allowed for victim impact statements, giving Robert and Emily the opportunity to express the profound and lasting devastation caused by Mark Miller's actions. Robert Jenkins, his voice steady but filled with a quiet anguish, addressed the court. He spoke of Sarah not just as a victim, but as a vibrant, loving woman whose life was senselessly taken. He described the irreparable damage to their family, the destruction of trust, and the permanent void left in their lives. He detailed the agonizing pain of learning about the affair, a betrayal that he carried alongside his grief, a complex wound that would never fully heal. He spoke of the lost anniversaries, the holidays, the future they had planned, all brutally stolen. Emily Jenkins' statement was perhaps the most heart-wrenching. She stood before the court, her voice trembling but resolute. She spoke of her mother as her best friend, her confidant, and the woman who had shaped her life. She described the unimaginable horror of discovering her mother's secret life, and the subsequent murder by the man she had loved. Emily articulated the crushing weight of betrayal from both sides, the shattering of her innocence, and the profound trauma that would forever alter her relationships and her perception of trust. She looked directly at Mark Miller, her eyes filled with a mixture of pain and a fierce, unyielding resolve, stating that his selfish actions had not only ended her mother's life, but had also irrevocably broken her own. Mark Miller, when offered the opportunity to speak, declined, offering no apology, no explanation. His silence was chilling, a final cold act that underscored the severity of his crime and his apparent lack of remorse. Judge Vance then delivered the sentence, citing the brutality of the crime, the premeditation evident in the concealment of the body and the profound impact on the victims. She sentenced Mark Miller to life imprisonment, with a minimum of 25 years before he would be eligible for parole. It was a sentence that acknowledged the gravity of his actions and aimed to provide some measure of closure for the Jenkins family. Life in Willow Creek, a suburb once characterized by its quiet normalcy, slowly resumed its rhythm, but it was a rhythm irrevocably changed. The Jenkins home on Evergreen Lane, though still meticulously maintained by Robert, stood as a silent monument to a devastating personal tragedy. The roses Sarah had tended continued to bloom each spring, a poignant reminder of her presence. Emily, after a prolonged period of recovery, eventually returned to Portland State University, determined to rebuild her life. But the shadows of betrayal and loss would forever linger. Her relationship with her father became a fragile bond, forged in shared grief and a quiet, unspoken understanding of their profound, irreparable wounds. The case of Sarah Jenkins, the teacher who had a secret affair with her daughter's boyfriend and was murdered for it, served as a grim cautionary tale. It laid bare the fragile nature of appearances, the devastating consequences of hidden desires, and the profound human capacity for both love and destruction. The quiet devastation lingered, a haunting presence in the community, a reminder that even in the most seemingly idyllic settings, the depths of human emotion can unravel lives with terrifying speed and finality. Sarah Jenkins was gone, her story a complex tapestry of love, betrayal, and unspeakable violence, leaving behind a family forever marked by her absence and the chilling truth of her final moments. The silence on Evergreen Lane, though no longer thick with anxious waiting, carried the echo of what had been lost, a constant quiet hum of sorrow beneath the surface.